Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. So I did an interview with the Niqabi Diaries a few years ago in which I talked about my journey to becoming a Niqabi or fully veiling. And in that interview I mentioned that there was more to the story that I wasn't really going to talk about in that video. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video, as I always say to anybody who asks me in person, that my reasons for wearing the niqab are much more social and personal than they are religious. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a Mexican-American woman who became Muslim when I was 15 years old. I've been wearing the full veil since I was 17 years old, and I'm also asexual. And if you're interested in how I became Muslim, I already made a 35-minute long video about that. I'll link it down below if you're interested. As for the asexual part, it's really not something that I talk about all that often on social media or even in person. So it's possible that you might not have known that about me, even if you've known me for a really long time, or even if you know me in person, because it's just not something that comes up in everyday conversation, but it is really relevant to the story. So I thought that I'd mention it right off the bat. So in addition to being Muslim since I was 15 years old, I've also been wearing the full veil since I was 17. That means that I've been covering my entire body except for my eyes, my hands, and my feet since I was 17 years old. And I started realizing a few years ago that my reasons for wearing the niqab actually had a lot in common with these stories of gender dysphoria that I started hearing at the time. I've seen a lot of videos here on YouTube lately talking about female to male detransitioners, and I've seen them giving their testimonies, and I've heard about this huge increase in the number of female to male transitioners and detransitioners that's happening here in the West right now. And I figured it was probably time for me to come and actually give my full experience as a niqabi and as somebody who went through what sounds like really similar struggles and discomfort in their body when they were younger, but who came to a completely different conclusion, a completely different route than becoming transgender. It's very sad for me to see how much regret these young women have, and every time that I hear them talk, I can relate so much to their struggles that I strongly suspect had I had access to social media and had been introduced to these ideas when I was young and going through these struggles, I also might have fallen into the same type of ideology that so many of these detransitioners have come to regret. So I can tell you that all of these years later, for reference, I am 30 years old right now, and I would say that all of these gender and sexuality struggles I was dealing with probably between the ages of 10 to 17. So that would put me at 13 to 20 years after the fact. But I would just like to preface this entire video by saying I am very comfortable with my body right now. I have completely accepted and just love my identity as a woman. And I'm really, really glad that I didn't make any permanent changes to my body back in the day when I was going through these struggles. I will say that I still suffer from what we're going to call in this video artificial gender dysphoria, or you could say that it's mild gender dysphoria, but either way, I manage it 100% through how I dress and some barriers that I have around my relations with the opposite sex, and that seems to do it for me, and I am managing just fine. And just a note here, I'm stealing that phrase artificial gender dysphoria from a detransitioner called Sally, whom I've actually seen under a few different channels and account names here on YouTube, so I'm not quite sure which one she's using right now. But if I can find that video where I heard her say that, I'll link it down below. But basically what she was referring to was this kind of discomfort in your sex, discomfort with being a woman that many young women feel that we think is inherent discomfort in our own bodies, but that actually just turns out to be discomfort or dissatisfaction with the way that the world treats us as women or as girls transitioning into womanhood, especially if we turn out to not be straight. So that transition from girlhood to womanhood is obviously different for everybody, and it's not something that I can shove everybody's experience into two perfect square buckets, but I do think that most people will fall on a spectrum of somewhere from kind of this 13 going on 30 vibes, super excited to develop and become a woman, can't wait to have boobs, stuffing your bra and wearing makeup and being super into boys, end of the spectrum, and then the complete opposite end of the scale where some of us are absolutely hating the changes that are happening to our bodies. We hate having breasts. We are not into things that the other girls seem to be into. We're not interested in makeup and boys, and we just generally don't seem to be having the same experience as other girls our age. I was as far to that end of the spectrum as anybody that I'd ever met growing up, But that's not really saying much considering I went to really small Catholic schools in really small conservative towns for both elementary and high school, and diversity in any sense of the word was not really a thing, but I still was the furthest to that end of the spectrum than anybody else I knew, except for two women that I can think of that I did go to school with, one of whom ended up coming out as a lesbian, and the other of whom who was a few years behind me in school and had more access to social media, who actually ended up transitioning and being a female to male transitioner. So I'll start with where my body dysmorphia began, and that would be when I hit puberty at like 9 or 10 years old. I know it seems kind of young, but I actually did start my period when I was 10 years old, and I have been pretty much fully grown since that time. I am 5'1" right now, and I was 5'1" when I was 10 years old too. And funnily enough, I actually remember getting measured that doctor's visit when I was 10, and I remember the doctor telling me that I was so tall for my age and that if I kept growing at that rate, I was going to be 5'8" or 5'9", and I never grew a single centimeter after that. Also, I'm not going to give you my exact bra size or anything, but I am larger in the chest, and I have been since pretty much that age as well. So anyways, it's safe to say that I developed pretty young, and I also happen to be the middle of 3 sisters. So I have an older sister and a younger sister, both of whom are shaped completely different than I am. So my older sister is more pear-shaped, so she has hips but has a really small chest. And then my younger sister has kind of small hips and chest. She's more of the taller, slender figure. And then the middle sister, was the one who was like short and really, really curvy. So both of them had relatively small chests compared to me, and that's kind of when all of this trouble started. My older sister was 12 when I was 10. We both started our periods in the same year, so I think she beat me by just a few weeks or possibly a few months, but it wasn't that long. So we started our periods around the same time, and then shortly thereafter I had pretty large breasts when she didn't. And both of my sisters were into boys since they were young, and I think they have both had their first boyfriends at like 14, 15 years old, by which time I was still not interested in boys. But you know, they were on the side of the spectrum where they wanted that sexualized womanly body that they didn't have, and then they saw it on me and then treated me kind of poorly for it. So my older sister used to tell me all the time that nobody would ever love me. If any boy ever talked to me, it would just be because of my chest. And even though I had zero interest in boys at the time, that's still a really hurtful thing to say to a 10, 11-year-old girl, and I took those things to heart. And the whole situation was made worse by the fact that I would tell them that they were disgusting for even liking boys. I would call them names that were not nice names for women because I just couldn't comprehend why they liked boys at all. The whole thing seemed disgusting to me. But luckily, we also had an older brother whom I had almost all of my interests in common with, so it's not like I had a lonely childhood, far from it. It was like my 2 sisters were their tight little friend group, and then my brother and I were our own tight little friend group, and our 2 groups didn't really see eye to eye on anything, but you know, we had each other. So all of this was happening around a time when everybody else seemed to be going through this transition that seemed to be on the same side as my sisters. I always say that I feel like sometime after the 6th grade, somebody handed out these manuals to everybody, all the prepubescent teens, telling them about their newfound missions to go find sexual and romantic partners, complete with instructions on how to dress and talk and act in order to achieve that. And whoever was passing out those manuals just totally skipped over me because I did not get one. Even well into high school, that interest in boys never came to me, or girls for that matter. No interest in any of that ever came to me, and I did not know the word for it at the time, but I do now, and now I say that I was asexual. So at that point, when my chest had popped out of nowhere amid all this torment from my older sister, it also instantly became uncomfortable to even sit at my desk properly. I'm not joking, but the 6th grade desks that we had at the time were at right this perfect height where the only way that I could sit comfortably was to slouch down and put myself underneath them, or physically lift my breasts up and put them on top of the desk so that I could write comfortably. And it was so uncomfortable, so embarrassing, and they just felt wrong on me. So I really hated my breasts and I took to wearing this big purple jacket around all the time. I'd zip it up all the way and just, it was big and fluffy and I felt like it hid my figure, but I'd wear it even when it was really hot outside. And I remember my elementary school principal, who was, a 40, 50 something year old white guy, telling me that he'd like to burn that jacket. And I remember kind of just chuckling at the time, like, oh, it's so funny, but it really wasn't. And I just was completely unable to articulate to this guy, and I probably would have been too embarrassed anyway, even if I had had the words, to explain to him why I felt the need to cover up. Then there was this incident. Well, I was still in junior high at a different school, elementary school, with my sister, and my brother was either in his freshman or sophomore year of high school, I don't remember which, but they had a dance at his school and my dad was going to chaperone for this dance. So me, being the follow my brother and father around type girl, I followed my father to the dance and I just waited outside of the gymnasium where the dance was being held on these couches. And I just sat there on the couches all night, but one of the guys in my brother's class, so one of the high schoolers, jumped on the couch next to me, put his arm around me and was like, hey. And I just had this complete visceral response. Like I freaked out. I don't remember if I started crying or not, but I know that I just wanted to puke. And it was just so traumatizing for me. And the next day my brother came home from school and told me, oh, by the way, so-and-so said he's sorry. He didn't know you were my sister and also he thought you were older. So all throughout my younger teen years, I was already really uncomfortable with the way that other girls, including, not limited to, but including my own sisters, were treating me. But I just, followed my brother and his friend group. All of his friends were guys. All of my friends were his friends. Actually, my best friend in high school was the younger brother of my older brother's best friend. So we just kind of had this little friend group and we all liked to play video games and watch anime and then sometimes play like actual console games, but I was more of a computer game person. But we'd get together and we'd have LAN parties and play Warcraft and Starcraft against each other and just ride four-wheelers around the orchard because this was in really Northern California where there's a lot of space and you could do that. So I had a great time with the friend group. But at the same time, it became kind of apparent to me throughout the years that, but in particular, my best friend and other guys, my age that were part of this friend group seemed to like me differently than I liked them. And this really bothered me because I pretty much thought of myself as just one of the guys. And I really was uncomfortable with the way that they started acting towards me. I tried to just shrug it off though and just, keep enjoying life. And I was really thankful to have a brother that I had everything in common with, even though he was more into, kind of first person shooters and Call of Duty type thing. I didn't play that as much, but I definitely did the computer games and I definitely did the motorcycle riding, actually more than he did. When we moved to a town where we had a little bit more space in our yard, our father got us like 100cc little Yamaha blue dirt bike, and he actually bought it for my brother, and then my brother was too busy playing video games that he was not interested in it at all. I loved it and I rode that thing all the time. So I was the one who mainly rode it, even though my father had originally gotten it for my brother. So I had pretty decent preteen years marked by this kind of discomfort in my body, especially in the chest area, which was only made worse when I got into high school and I had more guy friends, confessing their love and writing love letters to me and stuff, and me trying to awkwardly explain to them that it was nothing personal, but I just wasn't into guys without outright saying I don't like guys because, this is something that in our small town environment, mind you, this was around the time that same-sex marriage was a big topic in the US, even in small town America, because I think it was becoming, same-sex marriage was becoming legal at the time. So it was something that, like, I grew up in a pretty sheltered religious environment, and even though I didn't know the word for what I was, I kind of knew that like it wasn't what everybody else was or wasn't straight, and I didn't know anybody who, was out about being gay or any type of not straight. So I knew that I wasn't straight, but I also knew what that meant and how it was viewed by our community. So I just kind of tried to ignore it. And when I got to the high school, of course, the bullying that I experienced from my older sister spread to the other girls in the school, of course, And I felt like all the other girls in the high school were having a who could wear the shortest skirt contest that I had no interest in participating in. But I, wasn't wearing around this giant fluffy jacket anymore because I knew that I couldn't be doing that in, 110-degree weather all the time. But I was, at that stage where everyone's at, where you're like trying to find how you want to dress and how you want to present yourself. And all I knew was that I liked the color black and I just wanted to wear a lot of black and more coverage clothing. But I was wearing a sweatshirt one day where it was like just like a much thinner sweatshirt. It had a hood. It had a zipper in front, but it wasn't zipped up. I had it open that day. And I remember that I was standing outside the school with my friends, who's, my brother and his friends. It's a group of guys. My best friend was standing next to me. He's a guy. And one of the girls from my class came up to me and just pointed right at my chest and was like, "Your boobs are practically hanging out of that, I was so embarrassed and I immediately just like zipped it back up and like ran off. And it was so humiliating. I was just so embarrassed. I hated the way that both boys and other girls just made it blatantly obvious that I had this part of my body that I just had no interest in having, honestly. And I just remember feeling at the time, God, I just want to cut these things off. In fact, one of the most marked incidents in my memory of discomfort with my chest and, body and sex in general was one of the LAN parties we had that was a sleepover. And it was a sleepover at my best friend and my brother's best friend's house. And I remember that they made up my best friend's bed for me and told me that I was going to sleep in his bed in the room. And they, closed me in there and, pretty much locked the door at night. And then my best friend and my brother and all the other guys spent the night out in the living room where they were, probably snacking on, pizza and chips and playing Call of Duty until much later when I was already closed off in the room as soon as the adults went to bed. And I just remember thinking to myself at the time, like, this is so unfair and this is wrong. Like, I am just one of the guys. Why can't everybody else see that? Why can't I be treated as such? And I remember just being totally peeved that I had to be in the room all by myself while all the other guys were out there, playing Call of Duty in the living room. And now, as an adult woman, as a mother, I look back on that and say, wow, those parents made a good call and that was the correct thing to do. And I'm glad that they did that. But at the time, I just remember feeling like, this is discrimination. This is so wrong. I'm just one of the guys. Why can't I just be one of the guys and just be comfortable? And honestly, I truly believe that if somebody had told me at the time, oh, well, you can do that, there's an option to just do that. You just press this button or you just do this, these few procedures and you will just be like one of the guys and, nobody's going to question that and you'll be just like them. There's no difference. I probably would have jumped right on that. So I'm really glad that this wasn't introduced to me at the time. And then one last story to really drive home how it's not just boys and girls my age, but even adults. I already said how the principal at my school made that comment that made me uncomfortable, but even adult women sometimes said things off the mark that they didn't realize made me uncomfortable too. This would have been at Halloween before high school, so it would have been the last Halloween in junior high, so I was either 11 or 12 years old. We were all wearing our Halloween costumes to school, and I was a witch for that Halloween. And I was just wearing a regular, like, young girl's witch outfit, costume. It had like long sleeves. It wasn't particularly low cut in front or anything. It was, a young girl's costume, not an adult costume. And obviously it was black and purple because, it's me. And we went out to recess, and I remember one of the recess monitors, who I don't know if she was a teacher or a parent, but a volunteer, I think, just a recess monitor of some kind, who was kind of like pointing out all of the kids' costumes and saying what they were, and oh, how cute, it's so-and-so, and oh, look, Spider-Man or something like that. And when she got to me, she was like, oh, and you are a sexy witch. And I remember being so confused and being like, no, I'm just a regular witch. And I was like disturbed, like deeply disturbed that this woman thought that I was trying to intentionally be sexy when I was most definitely not. And it really bothered me. So that's where all of this started. I felt this deep discomfort with my body and the unwanted sexual attention that I was getting from boys and men at the time. And this was also happening around the same time that I started questioning Catholicism. And I'm not going to go too much into it because I already made a whole video about, how I became Muslim. But basically, I discovered Islam at the time, and I discovered the concept of hijab. So Those of you who don't know, the Quran orders both men and women to cover their private parts and to lower their gaze, which basically means not to look at the opposite sex. So and there's also a verse specifically for women that says to take your headscarf and drape it in front of your chest to cover your bosom. And I remember, coming across these verses and learning about the concept of hijab and thinking, well, that sounds like a pretty good way to get what I want, and it would be a more legitimate way than just wearing around a giant fluffy jacket all the time. And people, would question that a little bit less. It's a little bit more legitimate because it's from an actual religious tradition. So when I did become Muslim at 15 years old, I took to wearing hijab right away. And I know that hijab is a contentious topic for many Muslim women, especially for reverts or women who struggle with the hijab, which is probably a lot, if not most of them. There are tons of videos online that you can find about women talking about the struggles of hijab and how hard it is to, especially as a non-Muslim who dresses a certain way, to come into Islam and have to stop wearing makeup and have to loosen your clothing and change your whole wardrobe. Mind you, makeup is something that is contrary to the hijab because the concept of hijab requires us to hide our beauty and privatize our sexuality and to not display our sexuality at all in public or our beauty. And obviously the purpose of makeup is to enhance your beauty. So those two things are contradictory. So you cannot wear makeup with a hijab. So there's video after video out there about how hard it is for women to stop wearing makeup and, all these struggles with the hijab that, to be perfectly honest, I have never, ever in my life related to any one of those videos. Like, I know my Muslim sisters are going to hear this and go, what? But honestly, I can't relate to a single one of those. Like, I definitely think it comes from my asexuality and from my body issues, but not wearing makeup and, being able to cover completely and have a good reason to do so was a win for me that I jumped straight on it and I had no hesitation whatsoever. I'm not going to say that I was wearing perfect hijab right away because obviously I wasn't. At 15 years old, I didn't have the means, the money or the access to that kind of clothing. The internet was just becoming a thing at the time, or, internet shopping, I would say, online shopping wasn't as huge then as it is now. And obviously at 15 years old, I had just graduated high school and moved out of the house. I didn't have, a full-time job with a lot of money where I could just change my wardrobe from one day to the next. So my hijab wasn't perfect at the time, but I did everything that I could, and I definitely had the desire to do so. It wasn't, for lack of desire, or it wasn't like a struggle to leave makeup that was the reason I wasn't wearing correct hijab. So nowadays, I'm a full-grown woman, I have a job, I have access to, a bazillion Islamic stores online where you can easily get Islamic clothing. So I definitely don't have a hard time getting clothing today, but it was harder back then to get proper hijab clothing. But even though I wasn't wearing 100% correct hijab, I was still really enjoying the subtle differences in treatment that came from the changes that I was making in my wardrobe. And definitely there was a lot of racism that I was facing in Northern California, 15 years ago, but I was already a Mexican in a really small, mostly white, kind of racist Northern California town. So I feel like it didn't really make that much of a difference to me whether or not it was racial slurs towards Mexicans or towards, Muslims or, Arab people, because people assumed that I was Arab. I feel like that didn't really make a difference to me. But the difference in the way that men was treating me was definitely noticeable, and it was definitely a welcome change for me. There were fewer men ogling me in public or asking me out, and I honestly feel like just wearing the hijab, even at the level that I was wearing it then, already relieved a lot of the anxiety that I was, and dysmorphia that I was feeling around my body, and any dysphoria that I was having, around my sex too. So because of all the aforementioned body issues, I started wearing hijab right away. And when I was 15, I think it was 15 when it started, I started the process of getting accepted to an international exchange program to go study abroad for a year in Japan. So I got accepted to a program called Rotary Youth Exchange. And when I was 16, I got sent to Japan to go to high school for a year. Even though I was already done with high school in the United States, I went back to high school for a year in Japan. And it was during that year that a lot of these identity issues, because mind you, I was this, Mexican-American girl who had just converted to Islam, who didn't really, I didn't speak Spanish at the time. I wasn't really that close with, my Mexican kind of culture and identity. And I also, knew that I wasn't straight, but didn't really know the word for it. And the next thing you know, I'm in Japan going to a Japanese high school, sticking out like a sore thumb amongst, all my other Japanese classmates. But, it was this opportunity that I got in Japan to really see the US and see my life and my culture and my struggles from a completely different point of view. It's during this time that all of my identity struggles came to head, and it's here where I made the decision to wear the full niqab. So when I got to Japan, I realized that Japanese high school girls were having the same exact contest that the American schoolgirls were having about trying to wear the shortest skirt possible. And even though I still had no interest in participating in that contest either, the fact of the matter is, as a Mexican-American Muslim who was a foreign exchange student, I was kind of meant to stick out. I knew I was going to stick out since Japan is a very homogenous country anyway. So I really didn't have an issue with the fact that I didn't look like the other girls in my class or, dressed like them. But basically, I just wore the longest skirt that they had in my high school. If I can find a picture of what I wore, I'll post it up if I can find a picture. But basically, I think my skirt just went to my knees or just past my knees, and then I just wore stockings underneath. And I wore the long sleeve school shirt instead of the short sleeve one. And then I wore a matching headscarf with it. And that was kind of the, hijab that I was wearing at the time. So despite the fact that my father had actually asked me about the niqab and if I was going to wear it, and I told him, oh, don't worry about it, that's cultural, I would never do that. The fact of the matter is, I really didn't know much about the niqab at the time. I just knew, like, the research that I had done on the hijab was that the hijab itself was mandatory, covering everything except for your face and your hands and your feet. But covering the face seemed to be something that was kind of above and beyond, that some scholars, like a really small minority of scholars, said was obligatory, but most of them just said was recommended, some of whom said it wasn't even part of Islam at all. And so I didn't really see a consensus among the scholars in terms of covering your face. And the fact of the matter is, as an American, I was just influenced by so many cultural biases that even as somebody who had, read the Quran front to back and already accepted Islam and become a Muslim, I definitely saw the niqab as something that was, extreme. Like, nobody covers their face in, a free civilized society except for, like, bank robbers, like, I associated it, even myself, I associated it with, like, criminals or people who are trying to, do something hidden or do something bad. Like, I didn't even at that time, because this was, pre-COVID, I didn't even associate it with, like, medical masks or, like, covering your face for any other reason. I just thought that, oh, like, crazy people do that, or like extremists do that. And like my father, the only times that I had seen women wearing veils was, on the cover of magazines or in news stories about the Taliban and things like that. Like, it was always associated with extremism. So I told my dad that I would never do it, that I wasn't even interested in that and not to worry. But the fact of the matter is, I actually was kind of interested in it and thought that it was really pretty. So I'm not going to repeat the whole story because I already mentioned this part in the interview with Niqabi Diaries, but basically, fast forward a few months, I'm now in Japan. I am now in a place where people are covering their face with face masks, but still covering their face all the time, and society is running just as well or better than, socially, than it does in the United States. And society wasn't crumbling and falling apart to pieces, and all of these people were wearing face masks. And I myself had to wear a face mask when I had a cold. And so I started realizing that, like, maybe covering your face isn't actually something that's as bad as I think it is. And of course, my friends who had told me that they wear face masks even when they're not sick, just because they had, like, social anxiety, which apparently is a phenomenon in Japan. You can look it up. There are people who just wear face masks even when they're not sick, and pre-COVID, mind you, just because they have, like, social anxiety. And so realizing that people did this and that it was a thing, and that I myself also felt more comfortable wearing the face mask, I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll just, keep it on then. But I still definitely wouldn't call what I was wearing niqab, because ideally the difference between niqab and hijab is just, putting on a face veil. Like, I could remove this face veil and have perfect hijab on underneath it if I were doing hijab correctly. There's just a few inches difference, really, of skin between hijab and niqab if it's done correctly. But the fact of the matter is, majority of the time hijab is not worn correctly in the West. Maybe even in the East, I don't know. I haven't been to the Middle East or, East Asia, where predominantly Muslim countries are. Like, I haven't been to any of those countries. I've lived my entire life in North America, Mexico and the United States, and then Japan. But in that context, like, I'll put myself in the same category. I was not wearing correct hijab at the time. It was, as long a skirt as I could get hijab with stockings underneath, and then just like a face mask, So it wasn't full on niqab, but I was covering all the same parts. But the main issue is that my clothing wasn't loose enough. Okay, so now I'll get into that second incident that I mentioned on the Niqabi Diaries podcast that I wasn't really ready to talk about at the time, but I am now. So this was while I was at that level of coverage where I was wearing my Japanese high school uniform, like skirt down to my knees, but then just kind of stockings after that, long sleeve shirt, headscarf, and I was not wearing a face mask this day. So I was walking home from school in the Shibuya district of Tokyo, and on the way home, this man greeted me with Assalamu Alaikum in the street. And this guy was very obviously not Japanese. He was a black man who told me he was from, I think he said Ivory Coast, Africa, but it was something coast in Africa. But anyways, when he greeted me, it was like, oh, cool, another Muslim, because I had been Muslim for about a year at this time. And so I had only met like 2 or 3 other Muslims, and they weren't really what you would say, practicing Muslims. So I really hadn't met anyone else that I, would say was like a practicing Muslim. So I was like, oh, cool. And he was really friendly, and he just started talking to me, and we decided to sit down where we were standing right there in the street. There was like a little coffee shop like right next to us, so pretty convenient. We just sat down and kept talking, and it was the normal when you meet somebody, like, where are you from? How did you get here? There's not a lot of, foreign people in Japan. So when you run into each other, it's the usual, what are you doing here, for how long? And I ended up telling him that I had, been Muslim for about a year, that I was a revert, and he reacted the way that most Muslims, when they find out that you were not born into a Muslim family and you became Muslim, they're really excited to meet you, and they're like, oh, mashallah, and they're usually really excited. So we were just talking like that for a few minutes, and then after a few minutes of talking, out of the blue, and I mean this, like, from my point of view, this was completely out of the blue. I don't remember the exact wording, but he says something as blatantly direct as, so we should go have sex. And I just remember being completely like, what did you say? Like, I was completely taken aback. I could not believe what I was hearing. And he started going off that, oh, well, I'm looking for a girlfriend, and, you're here, and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I thought you said you were, Muslim. I know, that in Islam, we do not have any sexual relations or any type of relation, like girlfriend relationship, outside of marriage. That's completely prohibited. And I was like, yo, I thought you were this good Muslim. And then he drops on me, well, I'm not actually Muslim. I'm actually Christian. It's just that there's a lot of Muslims in the country that I come from, and, I don't see you guys all that often. So that's why I salamed you and everything. And mind you, he had been calling me sister this entire time and greeted me as if we were both Muslim, right? And it turns out that this guy was not even Muslim. He now says that he's a Christian and that he is interested in, going out with me and me being his girlfriend, to which I responded, that I had no interest whatsoever in going out with him. And I was so insulted, offended, and just, I felt awful at being so blatantly propositioned for sex in that manner, that's such a disrespectful manner. I almost had tears in my eyes. I'm walking away at this point, and this guy's following me down the street, and I just, with tears in my eyes, I'm walking as fast as I can, and he's walking after me, and, wait, I really want you to be my girlfriend. I really like you, blah, 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 blah. I'm just like, get away from me. I don't want anything to do with you, and you're not even Muslim, and so don't even, why are you even talking to me like you're a Muslim? And at this point, this guy says to me, wait, stop, okay, I've changed my mind. I've decided I am a Muslim because, here's what he says, I saw the light of Allah in your face, and I'm a Muslim now, and I've accepted it, so let's go get married. And I was just, literally, I felt like I must have stupid written on my face or something. Like, it was something this, mind you, I was 16 or 17 at the time. Like, I haven't heard a whole lot of dumb pickup lines, but this so completely took the cake that I was just like, I didn't even know what to say. I'm like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I felt more so than anything angry at myself because I felt like, am I not doing enough? Like I thought that I was covering correctly, even though I know, looking back on it now, that I was wearing okay hijab, but not 100% there. But I felt like I'm angry at myself because I just wasted like 10 minutes, 10 precious valuable minutes of my life talking to this complete imbecile who was just trying to get into my pants the entire time. And I was so heartbroken that I cried all the way back to my host family's house. And when I got there, I pulled what was essentially like a hijab that was too short to be a good hijab. It wasn't wide enough to give for full coverage. It was wide enough to make a good like face veil. So I cut it into that shape and I got some elastic and I sewed it together and I made my first half face niqab. If I can find a picture, I'll show you. And so from that point on, it was a combination of a lot of things, but in that moment, it was honestly like, wow, my sister was right. Like everything that she had ever said about that nobody was ever going to talk to me unless it was because of my chest or because they wanted to sleep with me. Like all of those feelings of discomfort in my body that had mostly up until that point had been, alleviated and suppressed by the hijab that I was wearing thus far. All of those feelings came flooding back and it was like, it's not enough. I'm not doing enough. And it was just like, I decided at that moment I was going to protect my time and my energy going forward in the future. And I was not going to let anybody see me after that unless they could prove beforehand that they were not a complete piece of shit. Because here I am talking to this guy thinking that he's a decent human being. And then it turns out
he's a real douche.
And so I decided at that moment, it was like that moment plus the Christmas party that I mentioned during the Niqabi Diaries interview that I won't go into the whole incident, but basically I had removed the hijab at one point while I was in Japan, thinking that it was going to solve an issue, and it didn't, and it made things worse, and I regretted it, and I promised that I would never remove the hijab again after that. It was that incident plus this incident with this man on the street and the gradual kind of changing of my mind, seeing the fact that, Japanese society worked perfectly well with people covering their faces, that all came together in that moment. And I don't believe I ever uncovered my face again after that. I think I kept wearing the face mask, and I think I purchased my first niqabs either while I was in Japan or shortly after getting back from Japan. But ever since then, I've been a full-time niqabi. So that was how I started wearing niqab, and I've been wearing it ever since then. It's been 13 years now, and there was an exception of a 3-month period a few years ago when I took it off and then I ended up putting it back on. But that whole incident, whole identity crisis that I went through was a story for another time. That'll be another video in the future. But with the exception of those 3 months, I have been wearing it continuously for the past 13 years. So ever since then, I've been so much happier, much more outgoing, and just, I think in a social settings and also with my own private inner circle and my friends, I just feel like I'm so much more myself. And I credit it completely to the way that I dress as being a means of me to completely privatize my body and make it 100 times more difficult for people to objectify or generally disrespect me as a woman, which I am very happy to be now, boobs and all. Even though I don't want the public to see them, it doesn't mean that I'm unhappy having them. I love my body the way that it is now. It just decreases the amount of like sexual or romantic interest that is shown in me and that kind of attention that I get from men. Although it didn't stop at 100%, believe it or not, I have still gotten asked out as a full-time niqabi. Especially online, you'll get a lot of people bothering you online who are looking for niqabi wives specifically, but I feel like in person, it really protects me. I always kind of say it's kind of like a little litmus test. Like I can tell by the way that people, treat me, what kind of man it's going to be. And a man who's just interested in sex or who is just looking at you for your body, they don't talk to women who dress like I do, So the people, I think I've only gotten asked out by a stranger of like, somebody walking up to me in public and asking me out maybe 2 or 3 times in the United States. And then in Mexico, it's happened a few more times in Mexico, but mostly it's people who are like, are you a nun? Why are you dressed like that? And I'm like, oh no, I'm not a nun, I'm Muslim. And they're like, oh, are you guys allowed to have boyfriends? Do you have a boyfriend? And like, things like that. I've had that question quite a few times walking in Mexico. But in the US, and just general in my life, I feel like I don't get those feelings of disgust and discomfort when any man approaches me with the wanting to get to know you proposition anymore, because the people who have done that, that I know, I mean, like not, getting asked out in public, but the people who I know who have, propositioned that to me, there are people that I work with or I've gone to school with or that I know personally in some setting, and I know from the manner in which they relate to me, in which they ask me out or which they talk to me, that they're interested in me because of my personality. Because, I mean, they never see my face, they never see anything else of me. It's definitely feels more genuine of I like you as a person and want to get to know you as a person type thing, instead of I like what I'm seeing and I would like. And in terms of sexual harassment, I think in the US it's pretty much dropped off. I don't think I've ever been sexually harassed really wearing the niqab in the US. I will say though, in Mexico, the sexual harassment issue there is much worse than it is in the US. And I still have 2 or 3 like large incidents of sexual harassment that I can think of that I suffered even while being fully veiled, but that is still significantly less because that's considering all of my time living in Mexico and traveling back and forth. So just a few incidents, I think that's a lot less than what non-veiled women suffer on a daily basis in Mexico. So in conclusion, there are many reasons for feeling discomfort in your body or with your sex, and I could kind of break those down to 2 categories of, gender dysphoria, like real gender dysphoria, or you could say it's just the more severe gender dysphoria of feeling this inherent discomfort with your sex that you would feel even if you weren't with anybody else, even if you were in a room all by yourself or on an island out in the middle of the ocean, actual discomfort with your body. And then there's the other end, which I'm saying artificial gender dysphoria, but you could say that you could make a case that it's just less severe gender dysphoria, which is, discomfort that comes from treatment of others when you step outside. That's, the way that the outside world tries to push you into one box or another when you don't feel comfortable with that. But at the same time, I mean, nobody lives isolated on an island by themselves. We all are surrounded by other people, and we have to deal with the way that other people view us and treat us. So I think there's also a case to be made that maybe there isn't that much difference between those 2 things as we think. And it's also a possibility. I'm not a professional, I'm just throwing it out there. So as for myself, I'll put myself on this category over here of somebody who wasn't feeling inherent discomfort in my body other than the, physical discomfort that comes with, having to get used to a new part of your body, coming in. Other than that, I didn't feel any inherent discomfort in my body. It was just the way that other people were treating me. I was just an asexual woman in a really curvy body who was dealing with a lot of unwanted sexual attention. But I was not born in the wrong body, and I don't believe that anybody can be born in the wrong body. So I'm gonna steal a quote here that I think sums it up perfectly. Mae West said that when a man stands up to speak, people listen, and then they look. But when a woman stands up to speak, people look, and if they like what they see, then they listen. This is a really sad reality that most, if not all, women will come to realize as soon as they hit puberty, and I feel like the necessary discourse surrounding this phenomenon has been completely lost amidst all of this gender ideology talk, which all seems really counterproductive to me, since a lot of the ideas that gender ideology espouses go directly against all of the anti-sexism work that we have been fighting for in the West for the past few decades. We as women used to fight against the concept that wearing a dress and heels and makeup is what makes us women, and presenting in a stereotypically sexy or beautiful way according to society's standards is part of what makes us women. Like, we fought for the right to do any job and dress how we wanted on any job and have the same rights and the same pay as our male counterparts. And the fact of the matter is, as much as some people aren't going to want to hear this, we have achieved that nowadays, okay? The societal pay gaps between men and women are no longer a result of societal sexism towards women, but they are just a direct result of our biological differences with men, like the fact that we have the ability to give birth, and thus the burden of childbirth, pregnancy, and those things that will basically result in us having the economic motherhood penalty at work, we are also physically less capable than men, okay? That is going to be true 99% of the time, that on average women are physically less capable of men, meaning that we can't do the same, physically taxing jobs that can be some well-paying professions for men. And then it also comes down to our just differences in what we choose as professions. And it's a long topic that could be a whole nother video, but I really do think that also comes down to our differences in biology, just the fact that men and women do typically value different things and have different interests, and you can trace those things back to differences in biology. And even though those things aren't true 100% of the time, we have all the same legal rights to do any job that a man can do. If we choose not to do so, that's on us. But there is no kind of societal sexism towards women that's keeping women out of certain high-paying fields. That's just us choosing not to go into those fields. There really is no social patriarchy keeping women down nowadays. I hate to say it, but the truth is the only thing keeping women down nowadays are the things that we have done to ourselves over the past few decades, going further than just fighting for, work rights, but actually coming down to destroying the nuclear family, not valuing the father's presence in the home, and also detaching sex from reproduction, which has resulted in a huge increase in single motherhood, which, surprise, surprise, mostly negatively impacts women rather than men because of differences in biology. That is the hard truth that women in the US nowadays don't want to accept. But once I accepted it, once I accepted that the only thing holding me back was me and my physical reality, like my physical biology, that I'm never going to be as big or as strong as my brother and his friends, and I'm never going to be able to have a biological child being on the other end of the spectrum, have somebody else carry my child and give birth for me. Once I accepted those things and realized that the biological limitations are the only thing that's holding me back, but I can choose to do anything that a man can choose to do otherwise, that was pivotal in me accepting myself. And even though those things they're big realities and they're things that we do have to grapple with as women, I've already grappled with it, and they've already had, a big effect on my life. I am, a small 5'1" woman who's not very strong, and I have already become a mother, and that was a huge pivotal just changing point in my life that could be a whole nother video. We won't get into it, but that did affect my career to some extent. But accepting the fact that, I am a woman and I have certain biological differences, but that doesn't have to translate into the societal differences that are being pushed on me. Accepting that was pivotal to me accepting myself and finding out the way that I wanted to present to the world as a feminine creature who is just going to be desired by men in a way that men are never going to be desirable to women, and realizing that that doesn't have to impact my life as much as I think it will, and I don't have to worry about society's expectations of how I should dress or how I should utilize or not utilize my sexuality. That's none of their business, and it is my choice and a right that I have in free society. Accepting all that just made me happy. So my message to detransitioners is this: don't blame yourself for the decisions you made when you were being lied to by adults. You were just looking for peace, and we can't blame you for trying to alleviate genuine pain and discomfort that you were feeling with methods that licensed professional adults told you were guaranteed to alleviate that pain. I could have very easily fallen into the exact same trap that you did, and so could so many of women who were back in the day considered just tomboys. Or, you can make a case that this is a little different than being a tomboy, because it's not just liking boy things or what society deems as boy things. It comes with an element of actual discomfort or sometimes even disgust with your own body. And I do think that that's a little step further than what I understood as tomboy when I was younger. But to anybody out there who is going through a transition or who is doubting their transition or thinking about starting a transition, I'd just like to urge you to consider other options, because there are other options, and I feel like there's just really permanent solutions to temporary problems being pushed on young girls nowadays. And you could also make a case that there are permanent problems, because I do see the hypersexualization of women, which is, my problem that I'm dealing with, as a permanent problem. But those problems, even if they're permanent, could still have other solutions other than making these really radical changes to your body that are going to result in, actual physical harm. I do not blame you for not wanting to have this hypersexualized version of femininity pushed on you. I didn't either. I'm just saying there are other ways to opt out of that than mutilating yourself. I recommend try changing the way you present to the world as a woman, but maybe with different clothing. Instead of changing how you present in your gender identity, maybe just change the clothing you're wearing. And I'm not saying go put on a hijab or go put on a niqab, or if you want to do those things, I think you should totally do it. Don't even think about whether people are going to mistake you for being a Muslim or things like that, because Muslims do not own the hijab, okay? There are so many other different cultures and different religions that also cover their heads in certain styles. So, I've seen, even with the full veil, even with the niqab, I have absolutely seen Christian and Jewish and even non-religious women and men, yes, I have seen one man, who wear the full veil simply because they have social anxiety and they were not even able to leave their houses before they were veiling, and that helps them. So if it works for them, who am I to tell them that they shouldn't do that? It's a lot safer than a lot of other options we have nowadays. As much as I'd like to recommend therapy, it seems that that is not even a helpful solution nowadays, because so many of the therapists are being taught that affirmation is the only option that you should go with. So that doesn't seem to be too helpful either. Self-love is such a complicated journey, and it's gonna take longer for some than others. But in the end, you just have to learn how to stop comparing yourself to other people, both to the same sex and to the opposite sex. Because at one point or another, everybody has wanted their body to be different, especially 15-year-old girls. Okay, some are gonna want bigger boobs, some are gonna want smaller boobs, some want a curvier figure, less curvy figure, wanna be thinner or taller. A lot of people want different noses, or they want different hair. There's people who want to be more muscular. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. As a woman, I would like to be more muscular, but I have to accept that I'm never ever going to be as muscular as a man unless I, do something unnatural to my body. But that's fine. I shouldn't be comparing myself to them. In the end, everybody has a different body that they admire or that they would like to emulate or have. No one is ever happy with their body exactly the way it is, and the grass is always going to be greener on the other side. But I'm just telling you, in this day of photoshopped, silicone-filled, and now surgically altered bodies, the grass truly is only greener on the other side because it's fake. So that's it. Sorry for going on a bit of a rant there. I hope you have a great day. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for watching.